Okay, right. Good afternoon, everyone. So today's DFMPC slash YTSE professional learning series, we start the series off with case studies. And I would like to welcome Claire Beswick from the Wits Business School. She is the head of the case study writing unit. Correct me if I'm wrong, Claire. And yeah, she will be taking us through an introduction to cases and case-based learning. Claire, thank you so much for making the time available for this session.
It's a pleasure, Jonas. Thank you for inviting me to be part of it. I just thought I'll turn my video on so that you can at least see who's talking to you, aside from that slightly old picture of me. Yes, so I'll share my screen with you. I'll turn my video off shortly, and I'll share my screen with you while I'm doing that, then we can go ahead. Okay. So just one moment, I'm going to turn my camera off so that everything works. And can you share my screen? Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Okay, I'm just going to go to the slideshow and hope that it all works. Okay, so this is that first page is self-explanatory. What I wanted to say though is that we can do this on a fairly informal basis. I've got a presentation prepared, but if you want to ask questions or find out more or interrogate some of the stuff that I've put up here, then please feel free to do that. At the moment, I can't see if anybody's hand is raised, so perhaps leave it for the end, but otherwise you could just sort of interrupt me in midstream and I won't be offended. So let's just sort of start. I thought I'd start by giving you a little bit of a history of the WBS Case Centre. It was established, come on, let me go up. Sorry. It was established in the late 1990s at Wits Business School. In fact, Wits at the time was pioneering in this instance, in that no other business schools had yet established a case centre or had any kind of case writing capacity. But we were very interested in using, and we actually were using case studies a lot in our teaching at the time, but we didn't have any South African and African teaching cases. And because the South African context is quite unique, we wanted to reflect that context in the cases that we wrote. But writing cases is quite a skill, actually. And at the time in particular, less so now, there was not as much sort of reward for the time spent in putting the effort into writing a case relative to writing a research article or something else like that. And so they decided to establish a centre that was tasked by writers who would work with the faculty members to produce cases with them. And since then, we've had like 2.5 full-time staff members and between 3 and 5 freelance writers. We use freelance writers a lot in the way we work. We currently have more than 300 cases in our collection. I joined the Case Centre in 2001 as a case writer, and I've been, then I took over as the head of the Case Centre in about 2003. And so I've been part of, it's been an amazing journey. It's the square peg found the square hole for me in terms of being able to produce stuff that's very useful in a classroom, but at the same time, very interesting to produce. I love to find out stuff. I'm interested in business, but I'm interested in anything actually. And I've really enjoyed that process. Our cases are set in all kinds of organizations, small listed, large, public, whatever kind of organization you can imagine. And they cover all of the subject areas that are you'd find in their conventional MBA curriculum. and some of our more specialized courses like the MM in finance and investment or the MM in new venture creation and entrepreneurship. With that background, I suppose what we should start talking about first so that we're all on the same page. And here, I might stop at the end of the slide deliberately to see if we're all on the same page. I don't know if any, and I'm sorry if I'm going to speak to some people who know this already, but I don't know if any of you have seen a management teaching case before or experienced being taught with one of them. But they're a particular style of case. There are lots and lots of types of cases that you find out there. Amongst them, the clinical and the law cases that people in the medical faculty might be aware of, the clinical cases, the law cases that the law faculty will use. But also you get what I call success story cases where they're there for knowledge management purposes to demonstrate something that was successful and to preserve the learnings overtly in that case, in that document. Some of these can also be used as marketing tools when a company's felt like it's done something particularly fantastic and it wants to let everybody know how fantastic it is. It'll use what it calls a case study for that to sort of market itself. But we're not writing those kinds of cases. These are derived from the clinical and law cases. They've got a particular teaching aim, adapted to suit management education. They were first used in the Harvard Business School in about the 1940s, as I understand it, but I might have my dates and facts a little bit off there. And the idea was to try and bring the real world into the classroom and to give students time to practice on making real world business decisions in a classroom. I just need I've got a beeper on my phone, which is unpleasant, but anyway, I have turned the volume off. So with that in mind, here is a description of a case that I've taken from a book called Writing Cases by Lenders, Malfa Lenders, and Erskine. It's a case, a description. This is the particular case that I'm talking about, right? A description of an actual situation, commonly involving a decision, an opportunity, a problem, or an issue facing a person or persons in an organization. It is written to achieve specific learning objectives or teaching objectives and requires the reader to step figuratively into the position of a particular decision maker. And we call that decision maker in case parlance, that's called the protagonist. And the decision that we're talking about, we call that a dilemma. I think I'd like to stop there for a moment. Are there any questions that would help you to understand what I'm talking about more, or does this dovetail with what you were expecting? I can't see any hands up, just by the way, so if anybody's going to have to shout out. Okay, good. It looks like nobody. That's good. Okay, so let's just talk then about why we use them. We use them for two reasons. The one is the way you learn, the way people learn, adults in particular learn, and the other is because of what you learn. And the two are quite interrelated, but they're found to be particularly useful in management education. The first is it's a very participant-based learning approach. So it's a case of self-discovery versus being told. I'm just going to click through here. What we find and what people in our classrooms, and I think in management classrooms throughout the world, people come in there having had a certain amount of experience. They're not completely wet behind the ears, and they know they've got experience quite often in a particular field that's more in depth than the faculty member concerned has. And they may have, in fact, direct experience of the particular topic that's under discussion. And it's such a pity to let all that knowledge go to waste. And to have the learning directed by the faculty member, when in fact there's so much value that can be derived from discussion of the topic in the classroom, where the students can share their experiences and learn from each other, where instead of them sitting on the receiving end of the wisdom of a faculty member, they're actually discovering and learning for themselves. And obviously there is very skilled facilitation of the teaching process on the part of the faculty member, so that and the questions that you ask in the teaching are fundamentally important, because they direct the flow of the conversation. They shape the way you want the learning to take place. But ultimately, it's involving and using and drawing on the knowledge of the students in the classroom, and that is a very effective way also for people to learn. They bring their own knowledge to a classroom, and they build on that knowledge. And if they're actively involved in that process, that knowledge is much more likely to stick. And more than that, there's something that happens when students get in sort of emotionally involved in what they're learning, and that they remember it more. And so what you like to do, if it's possible, is have some proper discussion, proper debate in a classroom about how to resolve the decision that is placed at the beginning of the case. And if I remember sitting in on a teaching of a case on Nedbank, an incentive scheme that Nedbank ran. If I remember, it was taught by a Harvard Business School professor. And boy, the class was just having such fun. And the people were getting quite heated as they debated the way forward in this particular instance. And they debated the pros and cons of various approaches. And you could just remember, I can remember that session, and I can remember some of the stuff that we were drawing out of it, even though I wasn't part of the discussion. I was an observer. And so it turns the students from being sort of passive observers to being actively involved in the learning process. And when that happens, the learning is much deeper and much more lasting. And the learning experience is a lot more fulfilling. And I also think that teachers find that quite fulfilling as well. Sometimes I think that faculty members who haven't either been taught with cases themselves beforehand, or before they actively teach cases themselves, are afraid of letting go of control of the class, because you do seem to do that a bit with a case where you leave so much in the hands of the student to come up with. And I remember one of our economics lecturers saying to me, and he hadn't yet used cases, but he'd watched the cases being taught at Harvard, and he said, I sat and I thought, this is amazing, but do they know what they're learning? And the truth is that they do know what they're learning, and but if you need to be able to teach them properly, so that at the end of the case it becomes apparent what they've learned. It doesn't just land up in a sort of an ether of kind of and I don't know how to call it, unlabeled knowledge in a way. So I think that cases are good because of the way we learn, but they're also good because of what the students learn. One of the ever-lasting problems that I used to have, as particularly in undergrad years, but also in and what I enjoyed when I came to business school in 1986, was that theory became more than just an abstract concept. It became something that you could apply. So cases are fabulous because if you've learned the theory, the management theory, you have a way of applying that management theory and those models to your analysis. So you actively are practicing it, and you can see the relevance of what you're learning. And that's another thing that is useful for learning, is that particularly with adults, but even with kids. I mean, I remember when I was at school thinking, when am I ever going to learn this? And that unfortunately also often related to maths, because I didn't see the relevance until now, when I wished I had remembered a lot more, so I would be better at things that involve maths. So there is a strong theory application process involved, but it's more than that. There's also a theory generation where you can sort of co-create theory with the class as you think about options and as you think about what's working and what's not working. And that's a much more creative process, which is very exciting to be part of. This whole process generates amazing critical thinking skills and analytical skills, because you get given a problem, you get given the whole lot of background information, and then you have to sift through all the stuff that's there and come up with solutions. So you can't just be a passive kind of person who's saying, give me the answers and teach me. You actually have to engage, and you have to think critically, and you have to think analytically to be able to come up with a solution. And all of those are crucial in the real world. Problem solving skills you develop as well, which is really important in the real world. Because there's so much classroom discussion, and sometimes you'll use sort of group discussions and group presentations, people develop confidence in presenting their own points of views, which again are important in the real world. And the ability to recognize and value different perspectives is critical, because you're going to have people from different perspectives in the classroom, some agreeing with you and some not agreeing with you. And in that space of the classroom, you're able to hear the different views and suddenly think, well, maybe my view is not right. Or maybe you hear and you've got to interrogate your own idea, and modify it somewhat. But at all times anyway, even if your views remain diametrically opposed, you have to recognize and value the different perspectives that are in the classroom. And that's a very useful outcome of this kind of learning. And then there's the ability to develop and to present an argument. It is really an important component of this, because the faculty, when you ask the questions, they're going to be asking questions, and the students have to have a response to it, and they have to have a reasoned response to that. And so it's not just and they have to present it in such a way, and so this is one of the skills that you can get from this method of learning. The other thing that you learn is making decisions with inadequate information, because a case is it never has all the information in it that you can possibly have, and that's the truth of the matter in every real world situation. And so you work with the best that you've got there, and then you bring your own knowledge to bear on the situation, and then together you can come up with what you might think is the best possible outcome. And what you also learn is that there might be more than one way of doing something. So when we write our cases, we don't direct the students to a particular answer, and we don't give them the outcome of the case, an outcome of that decision in the case itself, because in fact what what the company did might not in fact have been what was the best possible way of doing it in the first place anyway. So the idea, and this is something I should have explained at the very beginning, in fact, is that you're wanting to create a platform for learning, not about what happened in the company or the organization concerned, but it's skills and knowledge that people can take from that classroom situation and then apply in in the real world. So for sake of example, if you manage to read one of the cases that I gave you, the turnaround of the Joburg hospital case, for sake of example, you could learn a lot by discussing how to turn the hospital around, and um, and you can learn a lot about what not and what to do from what was happening at the Joburg hospital at the time. But the idea is not to leave the learning in the classroom, but it's that people who are in all kinds of management situations, all across in all different kinds of organizations, can take that learning and apply it in their own environments. And so that's really important, and that they learn that so understanding what the learning objectives are at the beginning of a case is very important, because that's what sets a case study apart from an ordinary old story. They can look like a story. In fact, if you write them well, that's what they look like. But underneath, and I'll come to that on my next slide, underneath there's a whole lot more that is at play. And this is where this is what this is transferable knowledge and skills is where I was coming to. That what you're learning is going to be taken from the classroom and applied outside of the classroom. And because it provides, I mean, look, you can never really bring the real world into the classroom. It's always a slightly fake environment. One has to admit that. But it's one of the best ways we know of bringing management decisions into a safer space where you can think about how to address these kinds of issues in the real world. So then, this is so what are the characteristics of a good case? It's content that will enable achievement of learning objectives. I think in subsequent sessions we might be talking about writing cases, and we can go through that in a bit more detail. But it all hinges on what you want to achieve. Without knowing that, you get yourself something fuzzy and amorphous and not particularly useful. So, but you don't have to write your own cases to be able to find cases that will enable you to achieve your learning objectives. There are whole banks of cases all across the world where you can go and look for cases, searching according to teaching objective or industry or subject matter or something like that, where you can find cases that you can use in your classrooms. So you need to find something that will enable you to achieve your learning outcomes. They're based on real life situations. Sometimes people make them up and they can be useful, but what makes a case such a cool thing is that for the students is that they know this actually happened, and that makes them invest more in understanding it. It makes it more exciting to discuss, it makes it more relevant, and it really does sort of deepen the learning, I think. It's possible to, and we have done this, to disguise a case, to write it in such a way that you don't know what the company is, because the company's, there's some sensitive stuff. It's possible to slightly fudge the characters in a case. We did that with one of ours, where the character was a composite of a number of different people, but the company itself was real. But really and ideally, they should be in real life situations with business or organization leaders that you could call into the classroom or call up on video as having approached this situation that's described in the case. There's a compelling dilemma, which is the decision focus at the beginning, with no obvious right answer. So all cases, all of our management cases start with, and we try to make it quite short and crisp, of 150 words or so, presenting the problem to the students. This is what Sagi Pillay had to do, was try to do. How should he proceed? I think that case was written quite a few years ago, and I wrote the dilemma a bit longer. These days I'd write it shorter, 100 words, 150 words, to try and grab the people straight away. And it's got to be something that they want to discuss. That is not some wishy-washy thing, but it's compelling and is going to make for an exciting and interesting discussion with no obvious right answer. because sometimes if the answer is obvious, there's no point in asking it. There's a well-developed protagonist, so that the main character of the case is somebody with whom you can identify, because you're wanting the students to put themselves in that person's shoes. And so you must try and build quotes and make that person come alive, so the situation itself comes alive. It's got a well-developed storyline, and that's what I was sort of was wanting to talk about earlier. It can look like a story, and it's not just a presentation of facts. It actually has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is a story. It's telling the story of an organization and a particular event within an organization. It must look and read like a story, and like a well-crafted story. But what sets it apart from all the other stories that you might read is that you know what the content is all there for a particular reason. And so I'm thinking about, I'd like to think of them a bit like as a bit like a pond, where you look on the top of the water at a pond, and it's just a pretty rippling pond with maybe a few trees or a few plants growing out around the edges. But underneath, there's a whole lot more that you can't see. But then a student, a good student, and then a class under the sort of guidance of the facilitator will kind of be able to go and swim in that pond and see what's there and pull it out and examine it. And all of those facts there but then become useful in the teaching of the case. It should reflect ambiguity and controversy. It's quite difficult to build this in every time, but because this kind of discussion base and the sort of, I'm going to use the word argumentation, but it's not really what you don't want, a big fat fight, but you want some disagreement and some discussion. If you can reflect ambiguity and controversy in the case, that's a very good idea. It should have enough information, but not too much. The cases used to be written really, really, really long. It's like 16 pages of text plus exhibits. And the trend now is to write them much shorter, but still not very short. But you, unless you want the students deliberately to bombard them with far too much information, to make them sift through all the rubbish to find the real nuggets, you want to include only what's necessary and not what's not necessary. Otherwise, it becomes a very difficult thing to manage in the classroom. And they're accompanied by a comprehensive and really useful teaching note. This is something at WBSB I've only managed to start doing more recently, but this is what actually makes a case useful to faculty members other than yourselves and other than the person who wrote it in the first place. And it gives a step-by-step guide on how to teach the case if you were wanting to teach it in the same way as the faculty member who wrote the case. These kinds of cases with teaching notes there are certain journals, and one of them that I know of is DHET accredited. You can publish those cases in the Emerald Emerging Markets Case Collection if you have a good case with a good teaching note. And so then not only do you get yourself a great teaching tool, but you also get yourself a DHET accredited Brink money and kudos. And so I think those are sort of the high level things. If there's, and that's about, that's where my presentation now stops. But if you've got any, if you'd like to answer any questions, please go ahead and ask. I might not have covered everything you wanted. Yes, Stephen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Claire, for that. It was really interesting. We've been trying to use a kind of continuous case study of the health system, particularly within the primary healthcare setting, trying to draw out all these different complicated aspects within healthcare and healthcare settings. And after this presentation, I realized we've probably done it. Probably made all the obvious mistakes. It's way too long, far too much information. Some of it's based on real life experience, but a lot of it is kind of thumbsuck. This is what, this is like the broad kind of picture that we see in different places. But so I am I'm very inspired by what you're saying, because I think this is why we've got a case study writer to help us to do this better. But what is your experience in terms of trying to do that, to write longitudinally, to write a long case study that students can go back to? And I'll tell you the impetus for this.
Yes.
We try to teach systems thinking in complex settings.
Yes.
And we want students to realize that there's never, ever necessarily one right answer, that there are multiple
Yes.
right answers depending on the viewpoint from which you're looking at the issue. So
Yes.
if your emphasis is around trying to improve human resource retention, or if it's around trying to shift the way that information is captured, those two things intersect. But if we're emphasizing one subject domain over another, we want to pull that out, but to use the same case, right? So students almost feel like they're living in that setting, and it keeps shifting and changing. I don't know what your advice is on how to do that.
So I would write it in parts, if that makes sense to you. So I would have a start, but what I would do actually is I would sit down with you and I'd understand more clearly what you wanted to achieve, right? But my gut tells me that the way to do it is this: to have a lot of distinct parts where that maybe are not necessarily happening in sequential order, are happening contiguously, in parallel, but you start with the part A of the case and you present them with the sort of starting dilemma, the thing that sets it all off in a way. And then, and that main case will have all the relevant background and other information that you will need on the organization. And then you bring in part B, C, D, E, F, all the other things, and you teach them in different spaces, in different lectures, or maybe in different parts of the lecture. And then the students will be able to bring in what they've learned from the one section into the other section. But what you then do also is you define the objectives that you want for each part of the case. And then you should be able to have something that is a bit more controlled and a little less messy in terms of its structure and the way it can work, but still uncontrolled and very messy as students try to grapple with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's quite a clear logic to this, and I like the fact that it is about returning. Sorry, my dogs are a bit excited. It is about returning to those learning objectives, really defining what it is that you're trying to teach, right?
Yes.
And so that makes a lot of sense, because we've kind of done that, but it was like the case study was like the artifact of the process, and in fact it could be guiding that whole thing. So it's just I guess it really is an art. I'm trying to get my head around it. But I think we've got something to work from. And now it's about cleaning that up and making it work better. Thank you for that.
It's a pleasure.
Can I follow on actually with a question around how one would publish that? How does that go into the that it can be used in other spaces? So, like, even though our course doesn't deal directly with, for example, management, it does. It could be of interest for other courses in other parts of the world that might be interested in the setting, the health care setting, but dealing with other issues. So sorry, I just also was curious about that.
There are different ways of doing it. It depends on how and your purpose behind publishing it. So there is an organization called the Case Center. Anyway, it's a dreadful name. thecasecenter.org. I'll put it up in the chat. Hold on a moment. Let me find the chat. thecasecenter.org. And they are a clearinghouse for cases from everywhere in the world, from the best known like Harvard and INSEAD places stuck in the middle of nowhere in the Bundu. And you can submit your case and they'll store it for you and they'll sell it, and then anybody wanting to get hold of it can look for it. And so that's sort of throwing the mud onto the wall, and then it's there for somebody to find if they want to. There's also a journal published by Emerald Publishing called the Emerging Markets Case Studies Collection. They publish cases that they have peer-reviewed, so you could submit it for peer-reviewed publication. That needs a case and the teaching note, and it would be peer-reviewed, and if it got published there, it would be DHET accredited. The Case Center also has a journal called Case Focus, which is also peer-reviewed, but not at the moment DHET accredited. And there are a number of others. Sage, there's a crowd, Sage Business Cases. I think I spelled it incorrectly. Sage Business Cases. It's published by Sage Publishing. We have some of our cases are in that collection as well, that they don't have teaching notes. They don't have a peer review process, and they accept cases from a wide range of institutions. So you can get your case out there. And then I think there are some Creative Commons open source places where you can access cases, but I don't know much about those, I'm afraid. Does that help you? Because I see Richard Cook has got a hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I can hand over to Richard. Thanks.
Thanks. Yes, Richard.
Claire, thank you. So it's particularly refreshing, if I might say, to be in this discussion as a clinician and a clinical educator with someone who's not in the clinical field per se, but is coming at this particular subject with considerable expertise in it, of course, but from a different field, because it's fascinating, because it forces me to consider historically how I've put together cases, and I confess that throughout my career, when I've written cases, I think I've done it in a fairly narrow perspective. It's always quite clear to me in the clinical context what the student needs to know in a case, and what I need to be presenting, or why I need to be presenting it, to learn the what, for the student to learn the what. But I've never, truthfully, I don't think I've ever, and just to sort of stimulate some discussion here, because colleagues can agree or disagree, but I'm not sure that I've ever considered optimally how a student learns optimally for the presentation and discussion around a case. And many of these points that you make are very much applicable to clinical cases. In that there's how many, from a clinical case perspective, there are not as many points of view. For example, there's a student that a student would want to that I'm expecting stimulation of for presentation of the case. However, perhaps I'm writing it in a way that and presenting and engaging it in a way that doesn't allow for any of that, and that there's a right and a wrong, and perhaps there's a for presenting a dilemma as you present, even from a clinical perspective, I can achieve the learning outcomes that I'd like, that are quite clear that a student needs to attain or to achieve, but done it in a manner that does stimulate some debate and discussion, and maybe there's a slightly controversial element to a particular case in obstetrics or internal medicine or pediatrics that allows for some deeper thought and some just to stimulate an interest in a case, and then I can achieve those fairly set learning outcomes that I'm wanting to achieve in the first place, if you see what I mean. I mean, I can get a little bit more creative, I think, in writing the cases for applying and stimulate their critical thinking, stimulate their problem solving, rather than just having a certain formulaic approach for wanting them to come up with a differential diagnosis on the basis of a certain number of elements of history. So there's quite a formulaic approach that we take in medicine. I'd suggest that we could perhaps we can perhaps step out of, a step away from, and I'm not sure. I mean, there are other experts on the call that can challenge me or agree with me or as they see fit. Thank you.
Yes.
So I'm just really thinking out loud.
I mean, I think thinking out loud is a good thing, actually, and that's a part of the this thing is where, and I suppose what you're doing now is part of what's cool about a case, is that now you're thinking about your own situation. And I have to say, I know nothing about clinical cases. I would make a complete fool of myself if I were to speak about them. But now something that I've said triggers something in you that's making you think. And now Penelope's wanting to comment. She might have a comment, and I see Keenan. So then that brings some more learning into the picture that you maybe hadn't anticipated, but it's all relevant and useful. So Penelope, I think you had your hand up first. So let me ask you, and then we can come to Keenan.
Okay, Wits always gets these things wrong. I haven't been called Penelope for many years, but I think my English teacher at school used to call me Penelope as a bit of a joke. So most people know me as Penny.
Okay, Penny.
I think that, no offense taken, don't worry. I think that one's got to look at what the purpose of the case is. And I've been using cases, but short cases, for, about 20 years. In my teaching, and I've incorporated more and more of them because the students loved them so much and found it a useful application of their knowledge. But I think that you have to really decide what it is that you're wanting to do. And sometimes you're wanting creative thought, and sometimes you're wanting to illustrate particular outcomes. And sometimes you just want to get them familiar with different aspects of the same thing. Something that is easy for everybody to understand would be iron deficiency anemia, where a young girl who's got heavy periods is going to be iron deficient, but for a completely different reason to a 65-year-old male who's got a carcinoma of the colon. And you want to use cases to highlight differences. One thing I may have missed in your discussion, though, is how you scaffold your students' responses. Obviously, your cases are very dependent on discussion and so on, and being led. But we have classes of 350 to 400 students. Yeah. And I've always used questions to scaffold the students' responses.
Yes.
I don't know if you have any advice about that.
So look, I'm not a case teacher. I'm a case writer, but I can help in some respects on this. It is, I mean, the fact that it's so discussion based doesn't mean that the lecturer takes a back seat. They have to think very carefully about how to teach the case and how to structure the teaching and the order in which you ask the questions, what questions you're going to ask, so that you can lead the discussion in the way you want it to go, allowing for the fact that you might digress in certain points. At the same time, you might also be thinking that you need to step out of the discussion mode and step in with a little lecturette to explain some theory. I've seen teachers do that. So they've got this 90-minute class, which is what conventionally happens in a management classroom setting, with a lot fewer students. I have to say, I know that people use cases in bigger settings. I haven't seen them done like that. So, and I'm not sure how well that would work unless you are using them, can break the students up into smaller groups or something. But anyway, you can then bring in some theory presentation in the middle of the teaching of the case, and then carry on with the discussion. So to teach a case effectively it's quite complex. I think it's often quite a lot more simple just to stand and deliver, so to speak, because you can have your PowerPoint slides and boom, off you go. So that's the only sort of input I can give there, and I hope that's useful.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's we do divide the class up, but we don't necessarily have sufficient facilitators to go around. I mean, often one person has to facilitate a large number of students or a large number of groups. So yes. I've always used a lot. I think about my clinical process, my clinical reasoning, and then I ask the questions to guide them through and to model for them the way that I want them to think about things. So I'm a hematologist, so I get them to look at a full blood count, and then I say to them, okay, so let's start by breaking this down. What's the hemoglobin level, and then what's the white count level, and so on. But it's quite, that becomes limiting because it doesn't encourage other sort of creativity.
So can I don't want to hog too much, but something that I'm thinking of, it makes me think of when we teach accounting cases, okay? Because I can talk a little bit more confidently on that area than I can talk in the clinical space. But there are particular techniques for drawing up a cash flow statement, for sake of example. And so you want to teach students the skill of drawing up a cash flow statement. And that's like a diagnosis almost, there's no debate about it. You just do it. That's how you do it. And so you can use a case in our instance to teach a skill, but then that skill must have be the basis for something else that's going to happen within the course of the case. And that's where the creativity comes in. So now you've understood the diagnosis, and then if you're doing an accounting thing, now you've done the ratios that show X and Y. What do you do about it? And I think that's where there's a little bit more room for more creativity. That's useful, Penny.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Keenan, I see you've got your hand up.
Hi, Claire. Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm the case study writer intern for the Department of Family Medicine and Primary Care. So this is really enlightening. Thank you so much. I just have a question around writing case studies. So let's say in conducting like research for health science systems, cases through ethnographic studies or interviews or however you conduct your research to write sort of these fictitious type case studies. We deal with a lot of, I suppose, sensitive subject matter. So I'd just like to know, like, how do you sort of maintain the preferred learning outcome of these cases and like the overall integrity of the case without sort of ethically compromising these real life personal experiences?
So look, I have to say that because what we do is quite different from what you're doing, we don't often deal with sensitive stuff, okay? And or we don't deal with sensitive stuff that's not already been in the public domain. The way we sort of protect the people who've been kind enough to give us access into their organizations and their lives. Not that we don't write very many individual cases, but some of them we do. The case gets signed off at the end of the writing process. And if it's not signed off, we won't use the case. So that and so the subject of the case gets opportunity to look at and review what we've written, and to be clear that we haven't made any egregious errors and stuff like that. And then they can sign it off and say, yes, we're very happy for you to use this case. They agree to participate at the beginning. We don't do any ethics clearance on our side. We just say, are you happy to be part of it? And they say yes. And then at the end of the process, they sign the case off. And that's how we can give them peace of mind that what is going to be out there in the semi-public domain is what they're happy to be out in the public domain. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Jonas, I saw you had a hand up earlier. Did you put it down?
Thanks, Dina. I just wanted to respond around the case study teaching. So which I in the end typed in the chat. But what I was saying is that I have found case studies like doing a case study online discussion also very valuable with large classes where, well, obviously breaking them into smaller groups and then asking a theory question that relates to the case study first, so that they go research a bit about the theory and then ask a question on the back of that theory question that's related to the challenge in the case study itself. And I found that students were very engaging, using the case study in that way, because they could also then immediately see what the real world application of, the theory is that they had to discuss.
See, I'm just thinking that sorry, I'll come to you now, Michelle. Sorry, I was just thinking about the idea of the clinical case relative to the sort of decision-focused case that we write in management education. And there's absolutely a time when you have to know that there's no room for debate, and you don't want people to be debating when there isn't room for debate. And that's where a particular kind of case, and maybe the one that you're more versed in writing and using, Richard, is relevant. But if you have broader objectives about it, then that's when you can come up with things that are more creative, and you can work in the area of the grey, which is where management cases tend to work a lot more. I'm just whose hand was up? Sorry, I didn't. It's Michelle.
Yeah.
Do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you very much. So I'm a pediatrician and a clinician through and through, and I missed some of the beginning bit. But when Jonas said to make the case related to the real world, so if you can help me out, or anybody, Prof. Cook or Dr. A or Mervyn, whoever. So, for example, today the students presented a case to me on the ward round. They prepare a case and they sent it to me. So we are at the bedside at one of the facilities. So if I just allow me to go through it, because I'm kind of got a bit lost with them. So it was a 6-week-old, and the main complaint, very, very well expressed. Mother expressed everything very well. So the main complaint, one was vomiting, and the other was shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, blah, blah, blah. So they then focused on the respiratory examination, and basically it's the child, and we graded the degree of respiratory distress, and the only findings were quite extensive crackles in the lung. So when they did the assessment, firstly, part of their diagnosis of not an assessment, but a differential diagnosis was respiratory distress. So firstly, then I had to describe to them or try and tell them that's not a diagnosis, that is just an assessment. So when we take it back to the objectives of what are we trying to teach them, I try and teach them around the cases. So they focused on the respiratory system, and then I ask them, what do we think of the vomiting? And what questioning, directed or indirected, would you then ask on the history? And then you can't just ignore the vomiting as though it's a non-entity, because it's convenient to do that. And I really struggle to get answers out of them as to an approach to vomiting, the color, the nature, the relation to fees, whatever. So there I came unstuck. And then so they completely bypassed that, which was common, because if they can't fit it in with the rest of their case, they just tend to ignore it. But I would have liked them to think, yes, maybe the baby's got meningitis and feel the fontanelle, or it's a 6-week-old male. Maybe it's a developing pyloric stenosis, whatever it might be. So to get them to apply their minds to a problem. Then we came down to the respiratory assessment, and then the differential, which is understandable based on what was the admission diagnosis was by the qualified doctors, is upper airway obstruction, bronchiolitis or pneumonia. So this kid had no wheezing, wasn't hyperinflated, and there was absolutely no stridor. So, that's, you wouldn't, maybe there was stridor yesterday when the child was admitted, but then they get very confused, because now you've gone from an upper airway disease to a lower airway disease, or both. And then when you try and guide them through the management, then the management literally encompassed steroids for the croup, not adrenaline nebs, but then hypertonic saline for what might be bronchiolitis, plus antibiotics for the pneumonia. And it becomes very difficult to try and give them clear direction as to what the case in front of me, because they're being confused by what they're seeing on the ground. So I don't know, anybody, any comments or thoughts or help or something? Thank you.
I'm sure this lady's.
It's looking a bit like everybody's as stumped as you are.
Sorry, I missed that, if you're asking me.
I was saying it's looking like everybody's as stumped as you are. There's no hands up.
Okay, thank you. All right.
But can I just say, Michelle, that I think that we can find when we're teaching in a different setting now, that students can battle with finding the right answer, and perhaps they haven't yet developed the right critical thinking skills, or perhaps they they haven't. There's some foundation that hasn't been laid earlier, that then makes them confused. Maybe, and I'm thinking of something completely different now, but you watch these air crash investigation cases on telly, and one of them related to a culture where the co-pilot would not question the pilot because of rank, and maybe there's something like that at play. So when we try and understand why people aren't getting to the answer you want them to get to, it's trying to kind of dig down to understand what's at the base of that and what's at the root of that. And it might just be laziness.
And yes, I'd like to add, if I may.
Yeah.
Sorry, and I've just gone onto another device, so I was trying to unmute to answer Michelle. And I think you're right, Claire. I think that the dynamic between student and teacher, or clinician and student is critical in terms of the dynamic of the space in which one's engaging, to allow for the students to be directed appropriately and facilitated. And I hear you that. Now, Michelle's a very good teacher, and as a pediatrician, and so will be well versed in that. But I think, Michelle, from you know, we speak about we speak about in the GEMP program the importance of initiating the discussion around the patient and the training around the patient and the patient's presentation, and then situating the students' learning within a certain framework, and then elaborating on it further. And how do we structure a case so that that we can situate the students' learning appropriately, so that they A, see the big picture, and B, are able to build the critical thinking within that, before we look to a list of just one point of information or one data element after another. Which, if I may, now you hadn't, you this is not how you teach, don't get me wrong, but the way that you presented it to us, it was a list. It was a list of that a Stephen Pence or a Janus van As on this call, as a non-clinician, would have seen it as a list. And so if we see that student as a non-clinical, which essentially in certain instances our students, you know, this particularly the ones in early years, we need to structure it so that we are building through the case and trying and testing their understanding as they go. Now, I know this is the approach you take, but I think for all of us to take a little bit more of a big picture view on how we are situating the students' learning within that algorithmic approach in many instances, of where they need to look at the particular presentation for how it presents one system to another, be it respiratory related, be it GIT related, etc. I mean, I think that's an important consideration. But we must. I'm gonna pause us collectively, if I may, Claire, at this point, because we've run out of time, and it falls to me to close us off, if I may. And I just want to. And I just want to really thank you, because I think this has really been very stimulating for us as both non-clinicians and clinicians to be thinking through our case structures and how we might improve on the introduce where we can some dilemmas. What I've taken is I've made a note in the chat that maybe we can all look at how it is that we can write a case, and Penny alluded to this, and that we've got our firm learning outcomes that we can build on, or that we need to achieve for our students, and then we can look to it as well in terms of this gray area, this area of creativity that really speaks to try to optimize the students' learning in a certain creative manner, be it around critical thinking, be it around problem solving, be it around a dilemma that they're needing we can introduce just to tweak their interest, to motivate for the students to engage around those firm learning outcomes and otherwise. So I think there's a lot that we can take away from this, Claire, and I'm very pleased to have someone involved with the Wits Business School in your case, in your area of expertise. We're looking at building our relationship as a faculty with the Wits Business School in different areas. And this is a really novel way that we've been able to do that. So thank you so much for your inputs, and Claire, and I'm very grateful. And thank you for your inputs. Yeah.
It's a pleasure, Richard. And what I'd be happy to do, because I think I'm due to be presenting in coming sessions, is perhaps to come and meet with you one for an hour or so, and just to talk through some of these things, so that I can incorporate some of those thinking and into some of the thinking, and we can think about those things in the coming sessions. Because I think I'm up for at least 2 of the next meetings, and so maybe
absolutely. So yeah, no, I mean that sounds wonderful, because if we were to take a very easy clinical scenario, that wouldn't be difficult for, that you'd be comfortable with? And how might we be able to bring in a little bit of creativity and otherwise? But of course, there are many non-clinical cases as well, and non-clinical learning outcomes for the clinical student. That's also very relevant. So thank you. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Colleagues, thank you. Thank you. And yeah, and to colleagues, we look forward to engaging further. And Yanis, you'll share with us again soon the next sessions and the particular topics, because I think we need to sort of bend those down and market those to our good colleagues on the call.
Yes, Prof, will do. Yeah, so next week would obviously be the Tech Tuesday, also around cases, but I'll ask Angie to send out the invite soon this week, and also then just send a reminder on Tuesday.
Excellent.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, and thank you, colleagues. Thank you, everyone.